I used to be a fan of Julian Assange. I still don't hold anything against him per se, but I think what he did was criminal, and I was wrong to support him. Though this realization only came with hindsight. What do I mean by that? Back in 2010 and 2011, when the WikiLeaks leaked cables started coming out, we wanted to know what our Western governments were doing behind our backs in our names. We had this inkling that our governments were involved in some dodgy activities. When the Abu Ghraib prison scandal broke out, it wasn't that surprising. Similarly, when the Guantanamo Bay scandal broke out, it wasn't that shocking either. We always wondered what politicians and diplomats were talking about and what kind of politics was being played with our tax dollars. So when WikiLeaks leaked millions of cables from all over the world, it opened our eyes to the reality of some shady things our governments do. At that time, I liked Assange for bringing this to light. Fast forward 14 or 15 years later, and we see that these leaks actually weakened our only form of governance, that is democracy. Democracy is not a form of government where our politicians don't do anything dodgy or shady. Governance is a tough business, and democracies have to compete with authoritarianism, which has its own set of rules. They might still do dodgy things, but now there are more checks and balances, and they probably watch their language more closely. Overall, you'd imagine that our governments are slightly better now because they're always worried about getting publicly humiliated by another whistleblower like another Julian Assange. However, inadvertently, this has made our enemies like Russia or China stronger, while we have become weaker because we're worried about whistleblowers. Our enemies don't worry about whistleblowers. They just shoot them. Just look at the enemies of Putin. How they strangely find themselves drinking tea laced with radioactive material, or surprisingly keep finding themselves falling through a window on the 4th floor. China is no different either. Stand up to President Xi Jinping and see what happens. Even ex-presidents are not safe. We have seen how children of millions of Muslim immigrants born and raised in Western countries often hold no loyalty to the countries they're born in. I recently listened to a Twitch streamer named Hassan Piker, who's of Turkish heritage, said America deserved 9/11. He speaks with an American accent, yet holds such views. He's very concerned about what's happening in Palestine because they are his fellow Muslims, but doesn't care about his fellow Americans. He thinks Americans deserved to be killed on 9/11.
This is so insane. America deserved 9/11, dude. Fuck it. I'm saying it. Like, we fucking totally brought it on ourselves, dude. Holy shit. We did. We fucking did in a video game.
So our democracies are up against people who do not play our lofty ideals. Again, I'm not saying that this gives you a license to be corrupt. No, not at all. I'm not saying that the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Great Britain should have a license to kill their political opponents for their political gains like Putin or Xi Jinping. However, I do understand that our governments sometimes have to get in bed with certain dictators or look the other way when certain dictators abuse human rights in their own countries. It's just inevitable, and holding our politicians' feet to the fire over such things is fallacious at best. On the one hand, it's good to keep our politicians in check, but we should do it responsibly. If we become too humane as defined by some self-righteous virtue-signaling do-gooders, while our enemies don't reciprocate, we'll be destroyed. Besides, you don't win any brownie points by being too humane anyway. Listen to all America haters. They still hate you and will always hate you until you are totally destroyed. I've said before that the reason we came up with the Geneva Convention and these humane rules of war was because we were the victors and held all the power. The reason we hold Israel to a higher moral standard is because Israel has a lot of power and the support of powerful Western countries. Hamas, on the other hand, has the support of other primitive countries that don't hold any power and consequently act barbarically. Yes, their ideology drives them to barbarity, but we tend to ignore them because we know they can't really harm us. Look what they did on the October 7th. Their barbarity didn't pay off. However, if we collectively become weak, then we'll become just as barbaric as them because self-preservation can make you do horrible things. So why get to that stage? Being good, moral, and humane is a luxury that can be taken away from us if we are not careful. If our enemies aren't playing by the same rules, then why should we? Again, it's good to keep our politicians in check for internal matters, but external matters is a totally different ballgame. If Gandhi were to duel with Genghis Khan, I think we all know who would win every time. Coming back to Julian Assange, maybe he wanted to become famous or do something important. And maybe he was actually driven by his own moral compass, believing that whatever he was doing was a good thing by exposing videos like the collateral murder video and embarrassing diplomats. Maybe at the moment he thought that he was doing the right thing. And for a long time, I thought so too. I was a massive supporter of Assange until he was arrested outside the Ecuadorian embassy in London. But then I realized that people like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange never expose or speak against Russia or China. Yes, Western governments have done shady things, but on a spectrum of barbarity, the West is nothing compared to Russia or China. Why is Snowden not saying anything about Putin's war crimes and his reign of terror on his political opponents? You could argue that he only wanted to correct his own country, but now he's in Russia and can't speak against it because he knows of the consequences. Fine. This alone proves that on a spectrum of barbarity, personal freedoms, and free speech, the West is light years ahead. Julian Assange's primary leaker, Chelsea Manning, was released after a few years despite causing the biggest leak in US history. Julian Assange would have been assassinated if he had embarrassed Russia or China, but that didn't happen. And I'm glad it didn't happen, but we must recognize this. When we criticize our governments and their misadventures, we tend to create an image as though the West is the worst. It isn't. If it were, millions of people would be migrating to other parts of the world rather than Western countries. So forgive me if I think that these guys aren't really martyrs or champions of free speech or whistleblowing. Julian Assange will likely come out, get a book deal, and make a lot of money and live comfortably for the rest of his life. Yes, I do feel bad for the time he's already spent in custody, but these people aren't as noble as we think. While I feel bad for him, actions like these hurt the West because our enemies don't play by these rules. Our politicians should be at liberty to do things in private, which might involve arm twisting or even blackmailing their foreign counterparts as part of governing. Restricting our politicians while Chinese or Russian politicians don't face the same problems doesn't make any sense to me. So I hope you liked today's video. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like me to continue making awesome videos like these, then you can be my patron by going to patreon.com/Sultan or buymeacoffee.com/Sultan. If you can't do it, that's fine. Just like and share. Until next time, ta-da. If you'd like to support my work, you can become my patron by going to patreon.com/Sultan, or you can simply buy me a coffee.